What happened when HOA Karen tried to bully an ex-veteran? I was walking my dog at 6 a.m. when I heard screaming from across the street. A man was on his knees in his driveway, shaking violently. A German Shepherd was pressed against him, trying to calm him down. Then I saw her, Karen, our HOA president, standing over him with animal control officers. That dog has to go. Now. The man looked up. I recognized him instantly. He was an ex-veteran. Ma'am, that's clearly a service dog, I started. Karen spun around. Did I ask you? This is HOA business. She turned back to animal control. Take it. The veteran suddenly grabbed his dog. Please. Grizzly saved my life. He's all I have. You should have registered him properly, Karen said. You've had 3 warnings. Grizzly was whimpering, licking the veteran's face as he hyperventilated. I submitted the paperwork. You rejected it 3 times. Improper documentation. Karen pulled out her phone and started recording. Everyone look. This is what happens when you don't follow HOA rules. The veteran, his name tag said Fish, was rocking back and forth. Grizzly had his paws on Fish's shoulders, doing deep pressure therapy. I'd seen it before. My brother has the same thing. Ma'am, he's having a PTSD episode. That's not my problem. Karen waved at animal control. Get the dog. 2 officers moved forward. Fish started sobbing. I did 6 tours. 6. Grizzly is the only reason I can leave my house. Please. Karen smiled. Actually smiled. Maybe you should move somewhere that allows unregistered animals. That's when I noticed something. 3 houses down, there was an American flag with a purple heart banner. 4 houses down, there was another one. Then another. Altogether, there were 6 houses on this street that had military decorations. Karen was too busy filming Fish breaking down to notice. You know what? Karen said. I'm calling the police too. You're disturbing the peace. Fish was gasping for air. Grizzly was desperately trying to ground him, pawing at him, whining. Karen stepped closer with her camera. This is going on our HOA Facebook page, so everyone knows what happens when you break rules. I looked at my watch. 6:19 a.m. Most people were just waking up, getting ready for work. They had no idea what was happening. Fish tried to stand but collapsed. Grizzly immediately positioned himself under Fish's arm, trying to support his weight. Please, Fish begged. I'll pay any fine. I'll do anything. Too late. Karen pointed at the officers. Take the dog. Use force if necessary. The animal control officers looked uncomfortable. Ma'am, we should wait for him to calm down. I don't care if you have to tase him. Get that dog. Fish clutched Grizzly tighter. You'll have to kill me first. Karen laughed. Drama queen. Just like all you veterans. Always playing victim. My jaw dropped. She did not just say that. Expecting special treatment because you wore a uniform? Karen continued. Rules are rules. I don't care if you're a veteran, a cop, or the president. When we're done here, I'm banning all pets over 25 pounds, she announced to her camera. All of them. This neighborhood will be safer without these dangerous animals. Fish looked up at her through tears, his voice breaking. Grizzly has saved my life 6 times. 6 sewer slide attempts. He's the only reason I'm still alive. Not my problem. Karen turned back to animal control, frustrated. Why is that dog still here? Get it now. The officers moved forward again. Grizzly's growl got deeper, more serious. He positioned himself between the officers and Fish, who held him even tighter. Please, no, Fish sobbed. Please don't take him. That's when I heard it. A door slamming, then another, and another. I looked down the street and my heart jumped. Every single house with military decorations had people walking outside. The man in the wheelchair was already rolling down his driveway toward us. The guy with the prosthetic leg was walking over. A woman in an Army PT shirt came jogging up the street. Karen was still filming Fish, oblivious to what was happening behind her. Look, everyone! Look what happens when you don't follow the rules. This is what... Someone cleared their throat behind her. Loud and deliberate. Karen spun around and froze. 7 veterans had formed a line behind her. The wheelchair guy rolled forward and spoke first. That's a service dog. Karen rolled her eyes. Not registered with the HOA. I don't give a damn about your HOA. His voice was ice cold. That's a service dog helping a veteran in crisis. And you're going to step back. Now. Griffin rolled his wheelchair forward another foot, the wheels making a slight scraping sound on the asphalt. The other 6 veterans moved with him, closing the gap until they formed a solid wall of bodies between Karen and the animal control officers. I watched Karen's face change as she realized these people weren't going to just stand there and let her do whatever she wanted. Her phone lowered slightly, her arm dropping to her side as her eyes moved from one veteran to the next. The guy with the prosthetic leg crossed his arms. The woman in the army shirt planted her feet wider. Karen's mouth opened like she was going to say something, then closed again. She lifted her phone back up and her voice got louder, almost shrill. She announced that this was HOA business, and they were all breaking the rules by being on private property during an official enforcement action. The veterans didn't move. Karen's face was getting red now. that angry flush spreading up from her neck. She pointed at the ground and said something about trespassing and how she could have them all arrested. The woman in the army shirt, Kyla, according to the name on her shirt, stepped forward from the line. Her voice came out calm and even, not matching the tension in the air at all. She explained that they were standing on public sidewalk and street, not private property. She gestured to the pavement under their feet, then to Fish's driveway where Karen was standing. Kyla's tone stayed professional as she pointed out that Karen was the one who turned a medical emergency into a show for her phone camera. I saw one of the animal control officers shift his weight and glance at his partner. They both looked uncomfortable now, not like they had when they first arrived ready to do their job. The first officer, a younger guy with a buzz cut, cleared his throat quietly. He moved a step closer to Karen and said in a low voice that they were going to wait for the situation to calm down before they did anything about the dog. Karen's head whipped toward him so fast I thought she might hurt her neck. Her face went from red to almost purple. She demanded to know what he meant by waiting, her voice getting higher with each word. The officer kept his expression neutral, but I could see his jaw tighten. His partner, an older woman with gray hair pulled back in a ponytail, put her hand on her belt and looked away from Karen toward where Fish was still on the ground. I turned to check on Fish, too. He was still clutching Grizzly, but his chest wasn't heaving as hard anymore. The dog had his full weight pressed against Fish's torso, doing that pressure thing that helps people calm down. Fish's hands were buried in Grizzly's fur, his fingers moving in slow, repetitive motions. His eyes were open now instead of squeezed shut, and he was looking at the veterans who had come to help him. Something changed in his face, this mix of hope and shame all tangled together. His breathing slowed to almost normal, and his shaking had mostly stopped. Griffin turned his wheelchair slightly so he could see Fish without losing sight of Karen. His voice came out gentle but firm when he spoke, telling Fish to focus on his breathing and let Grizzly do his job. Griffin's tone reminded me of my dad talking me through panic attacks when I was younger. That same steady confidence that makes you believe things might actually be okay. Fish nodded slightly, his eyes still on Griffin and his breathing evened out more. Karen must have noticed she was losing control because she raised her phone again with both hands this time. She announced loudly that she was documenting veterans interfering with legal HOA enforcement. Before she could say anything else, Sean pulled his phone from his pocket. He held it up at eye level, pointing it directly at Karen, and stated clearly that he was documenting HOA harassment of a disabled veteran during a medical crisis. His voice carried across the street, loud enough that I saw more people looking out their windows. Doors started opening down the block. A man in a bathrobe came out on his porch 3 houses down. A woman in pajama pants walked to the end of her driveway across the street. An older couple appeared on their front steps still in their nightclothes, squinting in the early morning light. More and more neighbors emerged, drawn by all the raised voices and the unusual crowd gathered at 6:30 in the morning. I counted at least 12 people now watching from various porches and driveways, some looking worried and others just annoyed at having their morning disrupted. A few had their own phones out, probably trying to figure out what was happening or maybe recording too. The younger animal control officer moved away from Karen and walked over to where Griffin sat in his wheelchair. He leaned down slightly and spoke in a voice too quiet for Karen to hear clearly. I was close enough to catch most of it, though. He said they weren't comfortable removing a service animal from someone who was obviously in crisis. Griffin nodded and suggested they could file their report saying the situation needed medical help first, which would give everyone time to figure this out the right way. The officer looked relieved and nodded back, already pulling out a clipboard from under his arm. Karen must have caught part of their conversation because her head snapped toward them. She stormed over, her phone forgotten for a moment as she got right in the officer's face. She demanded to know whose side he was on, her voice shaking with anger. She threatened to call his supervisor and report him for refusing to do his job. The officer stepped back and his expression went completely professional, that blank look people get when they're trying not to react. He explained calmly that they were assessing the situation and would file an appropriate report. His partner moved closer, backing him up without saying anything. Karen kept going, her voice getting louder as she listed all the rules Fish had broken and how the officers were supposed to enforce the law. The older female officer finally spoke up, her tone flat and official. She said they were animal control, not police, and their job was animal welfare, not forcing people in medical crisis to give up their service dogs. Karen's mouth fell open like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. She looked around at all the neighbors watching, at the veterans still standing in their protective line, at Fish sitting on the ground with Grizzly pressed against him. Her face was still that angry red color, but now there was something else there too, like she was just starting to realize this wasn't going the way she planned when she called animal control this morning. One of the veterans broke from the line and walked toward Fish. He moved carefully, not rushing, and I recognized the prosthetic leg from earlier. He lowered himself to one knee about 3 feet from where Fish sat gasping on the concrete. His voice came out quiet and steady, talking about a dog named Ranger who helped him learn to walk again after he lost his leg in Kandahar. He described how Ranger would position himself just right so he could grab the harness when his balance failed. Fish's breathing slowed a little as he listened. Grizzly stayed pressed against his chest, doing that deep pressure thing where his weight helped ground Fish in the moment. The veteran kept talking, mentioning how Ranger knew when phantom pain was coming before he did, how the dog would nudge his hand and force him to sit down before he collapsed. Fish nodded slightly, his grip on Grizzly loosening just enough that his knuckles weren't white anymore. I looked down at my own dog sitting patiently next to me. My leash hand had gone numb from holding it so tight for the past 15 minutes. My dog just sat there watching everything, ears forward but calm, like she understood Grizzly was working and she shouldn't interfere. I realized I'd been standing in the same spot this whole time, frozen by what was happening across the street. My morning walk had turned into this whole thing, and I still had no idea what to do besides stand here and watch. Karen must have noticed she was losing the crowd because she reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder. She held it up high so everyone could see, waving it around while she explained that rules existed for everyone's safety. Her voice changed, taking on this tone like she was the victim here, like she was the only one trying to protect the neighborhood from dangerous animals. She said Fish had multiple chances to comply with proper procedures. She said she'd given him every opportunity to do things the right way. She said she was just trying to maintain community standards that everyone else managed to follow without problems. A woman I'd seen at neighborhood gatherings walked over from 3 houses down. She asked Karen if she could look at the paperwork. Karen's face went tight for a second, like she hadn't expected anyone to actually ask for the documents. She hesitated, holding the folder against her chest, before finally handing it over with this forced smile. The woman started flipping through the papers right there in the middle of the street. I'd seen her before at HOA meetings, always reading through stuff carefully with this focused look on her face. She worked downtown doing something with legal documents, I think. She turned each page slowly, her eyes moving back and forth across the text. Her expression shifted as she read, eyebrows pulling together, mouth pressing into a thin line. She flipped back to an earlier page, then forward again, comparing something. After about 2 minutes, she looked up at Karen. She said the rejection reasons listed on these forms didn't match the HOA rules she'd read. Karen's whole body went stiff. She insisted she knew the rules better than anyone since she'd been president for 5 years. Her voice got louder, more defensive, listing all the ways she'd tried to work with Fish and how he'd failed to provide proper documentation every single time. The woman kept her voice level, pointing to specific lines in the rejection letters and asking which bylaw they referenced. Karen waved her hand dismissively and said the interpretation of rules was her responsibility as president. Over by the driveway, Fish had managed to sit up straighter. He still had one hand buried deep in Grizzly's fur, fingers twisted in the thick coat. He looked completely drained, face pale and sweaty, eyes red from crying. Everyone had watched him break down in his own driveway, and I could see the shame in how he wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. But at least he was breathing normally now, the immediate crisis over even if he looked like he might collapse again any second. The veteran in the wheelchair rolled forward a bit. He said they should move this conversation away from Fish's driveway and give him space to recover. Karen spun toward him and said Fish needed to be present for any decisions about his dog. The wheelchair guy's voice went hard and flat. He said medical needs came before HOA procedures, and Fish had just had a severe episode that required recovery time. Something clicked in my head right then. I'd been standing here watching like this was a show, but Fish was sitting on the ground surrounded by strangers after having the worst moment of his life broadcast to the whole neighborhood. I made a decision without really thinking it through. I walked across the street toward Fish, my dog trotting beside me. I stopped a few feet away and offered to stay with him while everyone else sorted out the paperwork mess. I said my morning was already gone anyway, and he probably shouldn't be alone right now. Fish looked up at me and his eyes were still that awful red color, wet at the edges. He nodded without saying anything. Grizzly shifted his position, leaning his weight against both of us now, his training telling him Fish still needed support even though the worst part had passed. The dog's warmth pressed against my leg, solid and steady, and I could feel the slight tremor still running through Fish's body where Grizzly connected us. The group walked down the street toward Griffin's house, Karen trailing behind them, still holding her phone like a weapon. The animal control officers followed at a distance, looking relieved to escape the immediate tension. I watched them go, then turned my attention back to Fish. My dog settled onto the driveway beside me, panting softly in the morning heat. Grizzly stayed pressed against Fish's side, his brown eyes fixed on his handler's face. We sat there without talking. Birds chirped in the trees overhead. A car drove past slowly, the driver craning their neck to look at us. Fish's breathing had evened out, but his hands still shook where they gripped Grizzly's fur. 5 minutes passed. Maybe 10. The sun climbed higher, warming the concrete under us. Fish shifted position and winced. His voice came out rough and scratchy when he finally spoke, apologizing for what I'd witnessed. He said he hadn't had an episode that severe in months, that usually Grizzly caught the signs earlier. I told him he didn't need to apologize for having PTSD. Asked if he needed anything right now, water or his phone or just more time. He looked around the driveway and spotted his phone lying near the curb where it had fallen. Asked if I could grab it. I stood up and walked over, picking up the phone. The screen lit up showing 6 missed calls from a contact labeled Mom. all within the last 20 minutes. I handed the phone to Fish. He saw the missed calls and his whole face tightened. Said his mother called every morning at 6:30 to check on him, that she worried constantly after his last hospitalization. This morning's incident was going to send her into full panic mode. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, then tapped the screen to call her back. The phone rang twice before I heard a woman's voice, frantic and loud even from where I sat. Fish closed his eyes and started talking in a calm voice, telling her he was okay, that Grizzly had done his job perfectly. The conversation lasted maybe 3 minutes. I couldn't make out her words, but I heard the pitch and speed of her voice gradually slow down. Fish kept reassuring her, kept his voice level even though his free hand trembled against Grizzly's back. While he talked, I noticed more neighbors coming outside. Small clusters formed along the sidewalk, people in work clothes and casual wear standing together talking. Some kept glancing toward where Karen had gone with angry expressions. Others looked uncertain, arms crossed, faces confused. An older woman I'd seen at HOA meetings stood with 2 younger neighbors, all 3 staring at Fish with concern. A guy in a suit checked his watch repeatedly like he was late for work, but couldn't leave yet. The street had more people on it at 7 in the morning than I'd ever seen. Fish ended the call and slumped forward, exhausted. Grizzly immediately adjusted position, pressing more weight against him. Movement caught my eye down the street. Sean was jogging back from Griffin's house, his prosthetic leg moving smoothly with each stride. He slowed as he approached us, slightly out of breath. Said they needed Fish's copies of the paperwork he'd submitted to the HOA. All the rejection letters and original applications. Fish nodded slowly and asked if he could have a few more minutes before dealing with official business. Sean said take whatever time he needed, but sooner was better while everyone was still gathered and motivated. I made a quick decision. Offered to go inside and get the papers if Fish told me where they were. Figured he could use more recovery time, and I knew how to follow directions to a filing cabinet. Fish looked at me for a long moment, then accepted. Gave me detailed instructions about entering through the front door, turning left into the home office, second drawer of the gray filing cabinet, folder marked HOA Correspondence. Told me the front door was unlocked. I stood up and walked across the lawn to his front door, turned the handle and stepped inside. The house was quiet and cool after the warming morning outside. Everything was clean and organized in a way that surprised me. I'd expected chaos or neglect from someone fighting severe PTSD, but the entryway had shoes lined up neatly by the door and mail sorted in a small basket. I turned left into the office. Desk clear except for a laptop and 1 notebook. Bookshelves organized by subject. The gray filing cabinet stood against the far wall. I opened the second drawer and found folders with printed labels in alphabetical order. HOA Correspondence was right where he said it would be. I pulled out the thick folder and opened it on the desk. The first document was dated 4 months ago. A service dog registration application filled out in careful handwriting. Attached veterinary records for Grizzly showing all vaccinations and health checks. A letter from Fish's doctor explaining his PTSD diagnosis and medical need for a psychiatric service dog. Stapled to it was a rejection letter from Karen dated 2 weeks later. I flipped through more pages. Second application submitted 6 weeks ago with additional documentation. Another rejection letter citing improper veterinary letterhead format. Third application 3 weeks ago with even more supporting documents. Rejection letter saying he'd used an outdated form version. I went back through all 3 rejections slowly, comparing them. Each one cited a different reason. Each reason seemed to contradict what the previous rejection had requested. The pattern looked wrong even to someone like me who knew nothing about HOA rules. The folder had copies of emails too, Fish asking for clarification about requirements, Karen's responses getting shorter and more dismissive each time. I grabbed the entire folder and walked back outside. Fish was standing now with Grizzly at his side, looking shaky but more composed. He thanked me for getting the papers. We started walking together down the street toward Griffin's house where voices were already getting loud. Other neighbors watched us pass, some nodding at Fish with sympathy, others looking away uncomfortably. The morning sun beat down on the pavement, and I could feel sweat starting to form on my back. My dog trotted beside me, completely unbothered by everything happening around us. Grizzly maintained perfect heel position next to Fish, his training showing in every careful step. We reached Griffin's driveway where the main group had gathered. Karen stood with her arms crossed facing Octavia and another man I didn't recognize. The animal control officers waited near their truck looking like they wanted to be anywhere else. Griffin sat in his wheelchair near the garage door, watching everything with sharp eyes. When he saw us approaching with the folder, he gestured us over. I handed him the paperwork, and he started flipping through it immediately, his expression growing darker with each page. Octavia leaned over Griffin's shoulder and pointed at one of the rejection letters. She said something I couldn't hear, but Griffin nodded and flipped back to an earlier page. Karen stood about 10 feet away with her phone still in her hand, occasionally glancing at the animal control officers who looked like they were trying to figure out how to leave without making things worse. The other veterans had spread out across Griffin's front lawn, some sitting on the grass, others standing in small groups talking quietly. Fish sat on the curb with Grizzly pressed against his leg, both of them looking worn out from the morning's events. I walked over and asked if he wanted me to grab those papers from his house. He looked up at me with tired eyes and nodded, then gave me directions to his home office where everything was filed. His front door was unlocked like he said. Inside, his house was neater than I expected, with shoes lined up by the door and mail sorted in a basket. The office had a gray filing cabinet against the wall, and I found the HOA folder right where he told me it would be. I pulled it out and started flipping through the pages while standing there. The first rejection was from 4 months ago, citing improper documentation. The second rejection from 6 weeks ago complained about veterinary letterhead format. The third rejection from 3 weeks ago said he used an outdated form version. Each rejection gave a different reason, and each reason seemed to contradict what the previous one had asked for. I grabbed the whole folder and walked back outside. Fish was standing now with Grizzly at his side, looking shaky but better than before. He thanked me for getting the papers, and we started walking together down the street toward Griffin's house. I could hear voices getting louder as we got closer. Other neighbors watched us pass, some nodding at Fish with sympathy, others looking away like they didn't want to get involved. The morning sun was getting hotter, and I could feel sweat forming on my back. My dog trotted beside me, completely unbothered by everything happening. Grizzly maintained perfect heel position next to Fish, his training showing in every careful step. We reached Griffin's driveway where the main group had moved toward the house. Karen stood facing Octavia and a man I didn't recognize who had a laptop open on the hood of a car. The animal control officers waited near their truck, looking uncomfortable. Griffin sat in his wheelchair near the garage door, watching everything. When he saw us coming with the folder, he waved us over. I handed him the paperwork, and he started going through it right away. We arrived at Griffin's house to find Octavia and the man with the laptop, who someone said was Wellington Moses, a lawyer from 2 streets over, comparing Fish's submissions against something on the computer screen. Karen stood with her arms crossed, her face red, insisting her interpretations were correct no matter what the actual written rules said. Wellington had reading glasses perched on his nose and kept scrolling through documents on his laptop while Octavia held up Fish's rejection letters one by one. Karen kept interrupting, saying she had the authority to make these decisions as president. Griffin rolled his wheelchair closer to get a better view of what Wellington was looking at. Wellington looked up as we approached and asked Fish when he submitted his first application. Fish answered that it was 4 months ago, his hand resting on Grizzly's head for support. Wellington asked about the second submission, and Fish explained he resubmitted 6 weeks ago after fixing what Karen said was wrong with the first one. Then Wellington asked about the third attempt, and Fish described submitting it 3 weeks ago with even more documentation than before. His voice stayed steady despite how tired he looked, and Grizzly leaned against his leg the whole time he was talking. Wellington's expression grew serious as he reviewed everything on his laptop and compared it to the papers Griffin handed him. He finally stated that based on the HOA bylaws he was reading, Fish's third submission should have been approved. Karen's rejection cited a requirement about veterinary certification that didn't actually exist in the governing documents. Karen immediately argued that as president she had discretion to interpret rules for community safety. Her voice got louder, and she stepped closer to Wellington. Wellington stayed calm and countered that discretion didn't mean inventing requirements. He said her pattern of rejections appeared to be arbitrary denial rather than legitimate enforcement. He scrolled through his laptop and pointed at specific sections of the bylaws, showing how none of Karen's rejection reasons matched what the rules actually required. The argument escalated fast, with Karen threatening to sue Wellington for slander. Wellington calmly responded that truth is an absolute defense, and he was simply reading the bylaws as written. Several neighbors who had gathered to watch exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with how nasty this was getting. Karen's face was bright red now, and she was practically yelling. Wellington kept his voice level and professional, which seemed to make Karen even angrier. One neighbor, an older woman in a bathrobe, whispered to the person next to her that she'd never seen Karen lose control like this before. Griffin intervened and suggested they needed to call an emergency HOA board meeting to address this properly. Karen refused, saying she set the meeting schedule and there would be no emergency meeting. Octavia pointed out that board members could call emergency meetings according to the bylaws, and she pulled up the relevant section on Wellington's laptop to show everyone. Karen insisted that wasn't how it worked, but Octavia read the bylaw out loud, word for word. 2 other board members who lived on nearby streets got called, and within an hour they arrived at Griffin's house. Both seemed surprised by the early morning summons, but grew increasingly concerned as they heard what happened with Fish and reviewed the paperwork Wellington had organized. One was a retired accountant named something like Robert, and the other was a former teacher whose name I didn't catch. They both looked at the rejection letters and the bylaws and kept glancing at Karen with confused expressions. The emergency board meeting happened right there in Griffin's living room with about 15 neighbors crowded in to observe. Karen tried to control the proceedings, but the other board members, both retired professionals who seemed to know what they were doing, took charge and established a formal agenda. They set up folding chairs in a circle and put Griffin's coffee table in the middle with all the documents spread out. Karen kept trying to interrupt, but Robert, the accountant, firmly told her she would get her turn to speak. For 2 hours, they reviewed Fish's submissions, Karen's rejections, and the actual HOA bylaws regarding service animals. Fish had to leave twice to sit outside with Grizzly when the stress triggered anxiety spikes, but he returned each time to answer questions. The first time he left, I could see him through the window sitting on Griffin's front steps with his head in his hands while Grizzly pressed against him. The second time, he walked around the side of the house, and I heard him doing breathing exercises that Grizzly seemed to be helping him through. Inside, Wellington walked the board members through each rejection letter and showed them exactly which bylaw sections Karen claimed Fish violated. Then he showed them what those sections actually said. The retired teacher kept shaking her head and making notes on a yellow legal pad. Robert asked Karen to explain her reasoning for each rejection, and her answers kept changing. She said the first rejection was because the veterinary records weren't notarized, but the bylaws didn't require notarization. She said the second rejection was because Fish didn't include proof of training, but Wellington found the training certificates in the original submission. She said the third rejection was because the form was outdated, but Octavia pulled up the HOA website showing it was the current form. Neighbors watching from the edges of the room started whispering to each other as the pattern became clear. I decided to stay for the whole meeting instead of leaving for work. My boss would understand if I explained later. Wellington kept going through each rejection letter and matching it against the actual HOA rules. Karen said the first rejection was because Fish didn't include proof of Grizzly's training certification. Wellington pulled up the original submission on his laptop and showed everyone a certificate from a recognized service dog training facility in Colorado. Karen claimed she never received that document. Octavia held up a printed copy with a timestamp showing it was attached to the email Fish sent. Karen said the timestamp could be faked. The retired teacher on the board asked to see both documents and compared them carefully. She looked at Karen with this expression like she was trying to figure out if Karen was lying or just confused. Wellington moved to the second rejection. Karen had written that Fish's veterinary records didn't prove Grizzly was healthy enough to be a service dog. Wellington showed the vet records, which included a full health screening and a specific note stating the dog was fit for service work. Karen insisted the vet should have used different wording. The accountant board member asked what specific wording was required. Karen couldn't point to any bylaw that specified wording requirements. She just kept saying she knew it when she saw it. My hands were getting tight from clenching them. This was so obviously wrong. The third rejection was even worse. Karen claimed Fish used an outdated registration form. Octavia pulled up the HOA website on her phone and showed everyone the forms page. The form Fish used was the current one posted on the site. Karen said the website must not have been updated properly. Octavia pointed out that Karen was responsible for website updates as HOA president. Karen's face turned red, and she said this was turning into a witch hunt against her instead of focusing on Fish's rule violations. Wellington closed his laptop and addressed the two board members directly. He said that based on his review, Fish had submitted proper documentation 3 times. Each rejection appeared to be arbitrary rather than based on actual bylaw violations. He said the HOA could face serious legal problems if this continued. He used the phrase, discrimination against a disabled veteran. The insurance agent board member went pale, like actually lost color in his face. He asked Wellington to repeat that part about legal liability. Wellington explained that federal and state laws protect people with disabilities from housing discrimination. Service animals are specifically covered. If the HOA rejected proper applications without valid reasons, they could be sued. The insurance agent started doing math on a notepad. He muttered something about the HOA's liability coverage and whether it would cover discrimination claims. Karen jumped in and said approving Grizzly now would set a terrible precedent. She said residents would think they could just ignore her authority and intimidate the board into giving them whatever they wanted. Her voice got louder as she talked. She said if the board approved this registration after everything that happened this morning, it would show that rules didn't matter. People could just gather their friends and force the HOA to back down. Griffin had been quiet during most of the meeting, but he spoke up then. He said the precedent being set was different. The precedent was that the HOA president couldn't arbitrarily deny legitimate applications just because she felt like it. He said that was the precedent that mattered. Karen stood up fast enough that her folding chair scraped loudly against Griffin's hardwood floor. She said she had been president for 5 years and never had her authority questioned like this. She said she always acted in the best interest of the community. The teacher board member said that nobody was questioning her overall service, but this specific situation needed to be addressed. Karen wasn't listening. She said if the board was going to approve Fish's registration despite her recommendations, then she wanted it on record that she completely disagreed. The accountant said they should vote. He made a formal motion to immediately approve Fish's service dog registration and issue him an official letter. The teacher seconded the motion. They voted right there. The accountant voted yes. The teacher voted yes. Karen voted no. 2-1. Fish's registration was approved. Karen stood there for a few seconds just staring at the other board members. Then she said she was resigning as president effective immediately. She said she wouldn't be part of an organization that didn't respect her leadership or authority. She said they could find someone else to do all the work she'd been doing for 5 years. Nobody said anything. The room got completely quiet except for someone's phone buzzing. Karen grabbed her purse and walked toward Griffin's front door. She didn't take any of her papers from the coffee table. She just left them scattered there with all of Fish's documents mixed in. She opened the door and slammed it hard enough that the windows rattled. We all heard her car start up outside a minute later. The two remaining board members looked at each other with these shocked expressions. The accountant said they now had a problem because they needed 3 board members and a president. The teacher said they should elect an interim president right now since everyone was already here. Griffin said he wanted to nominate Octavia. Octavia immediately said no, and that she didn't want the job. Sean said he seconded Griffin's nomination anyway. The teacher asked if anyone else wanted to be nominated. Nobody raised their hand. The accountant said all in favor of Octavia as interim president. Everyone in the room said yes or raised their hand. Octavia tried to argue, but people started clapping. She finally said okay, but only until they could hold proper elections. She said her first official act was to approve Fish's registration in writing. She asked if anyone had actual HOA letterhead. Griffin said he had some in his home office from when he served on the board 2 years ago. He rolled out of the room and came back with a sheet of paper with the HOA logo at the top. Octavia borrowed a pen and wrote out a formal letter approving Fish's service dog registration. She included Grizzly's name and description. She signed it as interim president and had both other board members sign as witnesses. She handed the letter to Fish. His hands were shaking so much the paper rattled. He stared at it for a long time without saying anything. Then his eyes got wet, and he had to sit down fast in one of the folding chairs. Grizzly was right there immediately, pressing against Fish's legs. The other veterans moved closer and formed a loose circle around him. Nobody said much. Griffin put his hand on Fish's shoulder. Sean stood next to him. Kyla handed him a tissue from her pocket. Fish held that letter like it was the most important thing in the world, which I guess for him it was. The meeting broke up around 10 in the morning. People started leaving to get to work or deal with their delayed morning schedules. I realized I had completely missed my normal routine. My dog needed breakfast. I needed to shower and get ready for work. I needed to call my boss and explain why I was going to be late. But watching Fish get that letter made missing my morning feel worth it. Before I left Griffin's house, I walked over to where Fish was still sitting with Grizzly. I pulled out my phone and gave him my number. I told him to reach out if he needed anything. Fish looked up at me and said thanks. He said he wasn't used to neighbors actually helping instead of just watching his struggles from a distance. He said most people saw him having problems and just looked away because they didn't want to get involved. I didn't really know what to say to that, so I just told him I lived 3 houses down and to seriously call if he needed anything. Then I headed home with my dog to try to salvage what was left of my morning. Over the next few days, I started seeing Fish out walking Grizzly around the neighborhood in the mornings and evenings. He looked different somehow, like he was standing a little straighter and moving with more purpose instead of that hunched, careful walk he had before. The first time I saw him after that crazy morning, I waved and he actually smiled and waved back instead of looking down at the sidewalk. Other neighbors were stopping to talk with him too, instead of pretending they didn't see him and crossing the street like I'd noticed them doing before. Mrs. Fleming, from 2 houses down, spent 10 minutes chatting with him about Grizzly's training while her kids petted the dog. And the Johnsons, who live on the corner, invited him to their weekend barbecue. Even old Mr. Camacho, who never talks to anyone, stopped his morning jog to shake Fish's hand and thank him for his service. The whole atmosphere on our street felt different, like people were actually connecting instead of just existing next to each other. Karen's house went completely quiet for about a week after she stormed out of Griffin's place. Her curtains stayed closed and her car barely moved from the driveway. Then one Tuesday morning, I was walking my dog and saw a for sale sign get hammered into her front yard by a real estate agent. Within hours, the neighborhood group chat was buzzing with rumors about where Karen was going. Someone said she was moving to a condo community downtown that had even stricter rules than our HOA. Another person heard she was going somewhere that banned all pets completely, which seemed perfect for her personality. A few neighbors felt bad about how things went down, but most people seemed relieved she was leaving. I didn't feel bad at all after watching her try to take Grizzly away from Fish during a medical crisis. 2 weeks after the confrontation, Octavia called a proper HOA meeting to address the service animal policy and all the other problems that came up during the crisis. She sent out an official notice to every house with the meeting agenda and invited everyone to attend and participate. The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday morning at the community center, and when I showed up 15 minutes early, the parking lot was already half full. Inside the main room, every chair was taken, and people were standing along the walls. I counted at least 60 residents, which Octavia later told me was the highest attendance in the 5 years she'd lived here. People actually looked interested and engaged instead of bored or annoyed like at the meetings I'd been dragged to before. Octavia ran the meeting efficiently and let people speak without cutting them off the way Karen used to do. Multiple residents brought up concerns about HOA rules being unclear or enforced inconsistently. Others wanted to know how the board planned to prevent future situations like what happened with Fish. Wellington raised his hand during the discussion period and volunteered to review all the HOA bylaws and create a simplified guide so residents could actually understand their rights and responsibilities without needing a law degree. The board approved his project immediately, and several neighbors offered to help with research and editing. One woman who used to be a technical writer said she'd help make the language clear and accessible. A retired teacher volunteered to proofread everything. Fish started attending the HOA meetings regularly after that first one. He sat in the back row with Grizzly lying quietly at his feet and didn't say much at first, just listened and took notes. But gradually over the next few meetings he started participating more, raising his hand to ask questions or share his perspective on proposed rule changes. Other veterans from the street began showing up too, forming this voting bloc that pushed for reasonable interpretations of rules instead of the rigid enforcement Karen had favored. Griffin became especially vocal about making sure HOA policies didn't discriminate against people with disabilities or service animals. The board actually started listening to their input instead of just making decisions and expecting everyone to follow them. I ran into Fish at the neighborhood coffee shop one Wednesday morning about 3 weeks after everything happened. He was sitting at a corner table with Grizzly lying calmly underneath, and he waved me over to join him. We talked for almost an hour about how things had changed, and he told me he'd started volunteering with a veterans advocacy group downtown that helped other vets navigate housing issues and disability accommodations. His whole face lit up when he talked about helping other people who were struggling with the same problems he'd faced. He mentioned he hadn't had a severe PTSD episode since that morning in his driveway, though he was quick to add that Grizzly still provided daily support, and he didn't take his improved stability for granted. Seeing him so much more confident and engaged with life made that chaotic morning feel completely worth it. The veteran community organized a monthly breakfast gathering at Griffin's house, and they invited me to the first one even though I'm not military. I felt really honored to be included and showed up with a box of donuts not knowing what to expect. About 15 veterans from the neighborhood crowded into Griffin's dining room and kitchen, swapping stories and catching up on each other's lives. The conversations ranged from funny deployment memories to serious discussions about dealing with injuries and adjusting to civilian life. Everyone was incredibly welcoming and treated me like I belonged there despite my lack of service. Griffin pulled me aside at one point and told me again how much my willingness to stay with Fish that morning had mattered, that small actions from regular people often made bigger differences than grand gestures. I left that breakfast feeling like I'd gained real friends instead of just neighbors I waved to occasionally. Octavia ran for permanent HOA president in the scheduled election 2 months later and won by a landslide against the only other candidate who ran. Her platform focused on transparent communication and reasonable rule enforcement, which really connected with residents who were tired of Karen's authoritarian approach to everything. On election night, about 40 people showed up to the community center to hear the results, and everyone cheered when Octavia's victory was announced. She gave a short speech promising to serve all residents fairly and make the HOA work for the community instead of against it. Under Octavia's leadership, the HOA board created a formal accommodation process for service animals and other disability needs. Wellington worked with Octavia to draft the policy, making sure it followed federal and state laws while staying practical for the community to actually use. The new policy included clear submission requirements, reasonable timelines for approval decisions, and an appeals process if requests got denied. They presented it at the next HOA meeting, and it passed unanimously with residents praising how straightforward and fair the language was compared to the confusing mess of rules Karen had enforced. Karen's house sold within a month to a young family with 2 kids and a golden retriever named Buddy. The new neighbors were friendly and outgoing, introducing themselves to everyone on the street within days of moving in. Their kids immediately hit it off with Fish, who had grown confident enough to volunteer as a dog sitter when the family needed help. I watched from my porch one Saturday as Fish played fetch in his yard with both Grizzly and Buddy, while the kids laughed and ran around. The transformation from that shaking man on his knees in the driveway was remarkable, and I felt grateful I'd decided to get involved instead of just walking away that morning. 3 months after the confrontation, the neighborhood held a summer block party that actually brought people together instead of just being another boring HOA obligation. I walked over around 6 in the evening and saw tables set up along the street with food and drinks while kids ran around playing games. Fish stood near the grill talking with a group of neighbors, and I barely recognized him at first because he looked so relaxed and comfortable. Grizzly sat calmly at his feet watching the activity, but not in that hyper-alert way he had during the crisis. Fish was actually laughing at something someone said, and his whole posture was different. More open and confident instead of the hunched defensive stance I remembered from that morning. Several neighbors stopped to chat with him throughout the evening, and he engaged easily instead of giving short, anxious responses. I grabbed a plate of food and found a spot where I could watch the party unfold while my dog lay down beside me, content to observe the chaos. The new family who bought Karen's house had their golden retriever Buddy playing with some of the neighborhood kids in a roped-off area. Fish walked over with Grizzly after a while, and I watched him showing the kids how to properly approach and interact with a service dog. He knelt down and demonstrated the right way to ask permission before petting and explained why they shouldn't distract Grizzly when he was wearing his vest. The kids listened carefully and practiced what Fish taught them while their parents watched with grateful expressions. Then Fish unclipped Grizzly's vest, and the dog immediately perked up knowing he was off duty. Fish pulled out a tennis ball and tossed it down the street, while Grizzly took off running with Buddy chasing after him. The two dogs played fetch together while the kids cheered, and Fish kept throwing the ball with a genuine smile on his face. I thought about that morning when Karen tried to have Grizzly removed, and Fish was shaking on his driveway, barely able to breathe. The difference between that terrified man and this confident guy playing with dogs and teaching kids were so huge it made my chest feel tight. Grizzly brought the ball back and dropped it at a little girl's feet, and she threw it with all her strength, managing to get it about 15 feet. Grizzly pretended it was the best throw ever and bounded after the ball like it had gone a mile while the girl giggled with pride. Griffin rolled over in his wheelchair and gestured for me to follow him to a quieter spot near the edge of the party. He thanked me for getting involved that morning instead of just walking away like most people would have done. I started to say it wasn't a big deal, but Griffin cut me off and said small actions from regular people often mattered more than grand gestures. He explained that my willingness to stay with Fish during his crisis and then stick around for the whole HOA meeting had made a real difference in how things turned out. Griffin said veterans notice when civilians actually care enough to get involved instead of just thanking them for their service and moving on. I felt kind of embarrassed by the praise, but also glad I had made the choice to help instead of just walking my dog and ignoring the situation. The party wound down around 9 as people started heading home, and I leashed up my dog to walk back to my house. I passed Fish on the way, and he waved goodbye, looking tired but happy in a way I had never seen before. Walking home, I thought about how one morning had changed our entire street in ways I never expected. Fish had his support system now with the veteran community and regular neighbors who actually knew his name. The HOA functioned better under Octavia's leadership with clear rules and fair enforcement instead of Karen's power trips. Neighbors actually knew each other now and stopped to chat instead of just waving from their cars. It wasn't a perfect ending because Fish still dealt with PTSD and Grizzly still worked every day to keep him stable. But it was a genuinely better community than we had before when everyone just minded their own business and let the HOA president bully whoever she wanted. My dog pulled toward home eager for dinner, and I followed thinking about how sometimes getting involved in someone else's problem turns out to be exactly the right choice, even when it messes up your whole morning.